What does it take to be a trailblazer in your given career field? Well, today we're going to get into it. I have today on the Stories of Service podcast, Jessica Ruttenber. Jessica, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm a little cold, even though I'm in Alabama.
Well, it has been cold pretty much everywhere. I'm down here in Mississippi, and I'm actually cold as well. So you are not alone in that regard.
Oh yeah.
So today we're going to be discussing a lot of different initiatives that are going on in women in aviation. And with me today, I have, as I said, a trailblazing U.S. Air Force pilot who turned her vertical challenges into an incredible aviation career. With over 3,000 flight hours, Jessica soared as a senior pilot and became a fierce advocate for diversity, inclusion, and equality in the military and aviation industries. And as we know, diversity and inclusion have been a hot topic lately, which I have covered in depth on my social media and in posts. So today we're going to talk about her advocating for the Department of Defense first maternity flight suit, which met the unique needs of women female pilots, leading efforts to redesign Air Force aircraft standards to eliminate one-day height restrictions that are excluding 44% of women, which I couldn't believe, by the way, from aviation roles. Championing the Equality Military Mothers Amendment in the FY21 NDAA, which protects 200,000 Armed Forces members from pregnancy-related discrimination. And now retired, Jessica shares her passion for breaking barriers and continues as the director of Level Up Aviation, where she creates opportunities for underserved communities and pushes for a more inclusive aviation industry. So today we're going to talk about resilience, advocacy, and the power of change. Welcome again, Jessica.
Thank you. That's a long intro. I appreciate it.
Yes, I always like to give my audience a little bit of backstory about what we're going to talk about and a little bit about why you were selected to come on the Stories of Service podcast and how you are, in my mind, a change maker and somebody who's willing to speak up and speak out, just like myself. So first off, I always ask my guests, where were they born and raised, and why did you desire to join the Air Force?
I was born in Washington, D.C., and I was there as a young girl. And then we moved to Pensacola, Florida. My dad, he took a job at the commissary at the Naval Air Base there. I spent most of my childhood there until about high school, and then I came back to the D.C. area. Went to high school in Maryland, and I don't know if you're familiar. You probably are because you're so close to Pensacola. But Blue Angels, right? Mm-hmm. The Blue Angels flight demonstration team. My mom was obsessed with watching the Blue Angels, and she was trying to get the perfect shot every time. She would go to the practices. She would direct me to the base, the museum, everything. So I was kind of brainwashed at an early age to be fascinated with aviation. So that's where my love started. And eventually, I knew I wanted to join the military. I knew I wanted to be part of combat arms, but unfortunately, women weren't allowed to be in the combat arms. So the closest thing I could do was become a pilot. I thought it'd be really cool to be an A-10 pilot and do close air support to support, our brothers in arms on the ground. But that's kind of where we're going with this story. It was fascinating because when I was seeing the Blue Angels, I didn't realize women couldn't fly fighters at the time. It was the 80s, man, and it wasn't until 1993 they could fly fighter aircraft. So to me, I wasn't quite resonating with the I can be a pilot until I saw a pilot in middle school. And it must have been a heavy pilot because women weren't, again, flying fighters. But then when I saw her, I was like, oh, I didn't know that was an option. Like, we can be pilots. And I was like, click. And that's why I wanted to join the Air Force.
This just shows you the power of representation and being able to see what you can one day be by having people who have come before you who are in those positions. Had you not seen that, do you think you would have even thought that you could do it?
Probably not. I can't say for certain, but I was raised in a very Catholic family. Women couldn't be altar girls. There's a lot of expectation that I would be not exactly in the military career field, but I would be doing stuff more domesticated, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. And on here from Amber Adventures LLC, and she said she loved being an A-10 crew chief and supporting our Warthog pilots. So thank you. I know you had put a comment in there earlier, Amber, that you were going to be on the show. So thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Amber. I checked out your profile. Thank you for your service.
Yeah, she runs a LLC that's dedicated to people who are veterans who do travel, and especially with an emphasis on disability travel. So she's an upcoming guest. Can't wait to have her on. So after you made the decision that you were going to become a pilot, tell me a little bit about what happened when you were in your school. I watched a video about that, and you were going through the medical qualifications to become a pilot.
Right. If anybody knows my backstory, I didn't come in straight commissioning to be a pilot. I ended up going through to be a comm officer. They call it cyber today. And then I cross-trained and I was a captain. So it's called what they say light rated. So I was up against a clock before I aged out. Those standards are different now because they want to open up to more breadth of people that they're, you don't have to be under the age of whatever it was at the time. I think it was 28 and below the rank of captain at 6 years in service. So when I joined the Air Force and cross-flowed, it took a lot of waivers for me to get in because of eyes and many other reasons. So I was kind of starting to become familiar with the waiver process if you needed a waiver. But after doing all of that, I get to pilot training. I'm like, I'm here. I'm the captain of my class. I'm here a little late, but that's okay. I made it. And I am sitting in the first day of class in, we're in blues at the time because you have to earn your flight suit. And we're standing up talking about what we want to fly and where we're from.
And I'm still here. I'm just putting you on solo because I want you to tell the story. I was like, full attention. Yes.
And, I get up, I introduce, hi, I'm Jess Lorraine. I want to fly the A-10, yada, yada, yada. And then the back room, the door opens and the flight commander pulls me out of the class and tells me that I had failed my flight physical. And I'm really confused because I've done all the waivers. I know there was problems with my eyes before. There was depth perception. I had astigmatism, all these things I had waivers for. But he's like, no, it's not your eyes. It's your height. And you're like, well, how do they send you to pilot training? Well, you have to be 5'4" standing height, right? The minimum standing height. And there's a upper echelon too, that's 77 inches. So you got 64 inches to 77 inches. And I was measured at 5'4" when I left my base and I got accepted into pilot training, but I had to take a physical along the way to pilot training. And when I was standing up, this lady was pushing on my head. I wasn't even actually worried about it because I didn't actually know the minimum really. It wasn't in my cross check. I was so worried about my eyes and failing my, depth perception test again. And I didn't pass it. I was 5'3.5", and she didn't really mention anything. And they took some additional measurements and then they sent me on my way and I started class. So no one said anything. And I was pretty devastated, but also really stubborn and determined that I made it this far. I'm not going to quit. But they didn't really have a waiver for height at the time. What they did have was an exception for policy. So I had to drive physically around the country. They let me go permissive TDY, meaning they're not going to pay for anything, but they're going to give me the time off to drive around and get measured. And by the way, they're not setting this up for me. I have to call through, people I know, and find a pilot and find a flight doctor and find a plane and get measured in it to prove that I can reach the flight controls safely and fly. So I'm driving to Charleston and get measured in a C-17. I go to Little Rock. I get measured in a C-130. I'm in Meridian, Mississippi. They had 135s at the time. And I'm like going around the country trying to find an aircraft that I can fit. And I ended up being able to fly the KC-135 and was allowed to re-enter pilot training a few months later.
I just can't believe that you went through that. I mean, there are so many people that would have just quit. They would have just said, you know what, this won't work out. I don't meet the standards. And I'm just really surprised that this is even an issue because there are so many people, especially women, who don't meet this height requirement, correct?
Right. And so I just want to put the numbers out there. So if someone's listening to this and they don't get to watch the whole podcast, so I wrote them down because I don't want to be inaccurate with my little cue cards here. So when we talk 44% of women are eliminated, that is between the ages of 20 to 29 for a U.S. female. That's the inches I told you about, 64 to 77 inches. But you also get measured for your sitting height. And if you haven't figured out, Teresa, you don't stand and fly. I figured you probably know that. You sit and fly. So it's important that when you're sitting, that your posture from your hip to your eyesight, that you can see out, especially if you fly an aircraft with a HUD. And that is 34 inches to 40 inches. So a lot of people fail the sitting height, even though they pass standing height. But because our anthropometric database, which is a fancy way of saying, how big you can be as a human being, not just standing height, but like, your length of your arm, the length of your fingers, all those kind of things, it ended up eliminating 74% of Black women and 72% of Hispanic women and 61% of Asian women because of the sitting height, because we use this 1960 standard using one type of body, which kind of makes sense at the time, that we have different proportions based on our background. So I can be 5'4", and another lady can be 5'4" standing next to me. So I'm passing the standing height and she's passing the standing height. But because I'm white, my torso on average, not individually, but on average, is going to be longer with shorter legs. So a Black woman is going to have a shorter torso with longer legs. So that's why we have eliminated so many minorities for the sitting height, which we don't talk about either.
Nobody talks about this.
No, and I excavated this data from Right Pat. There is an amazing team there. I'm trying to do I want to say their name? I want to give everyone credit. So if you're watching, I'm sorry. I just don't want to get you in trouble too. So I take this data, right? Because enough people had left breadcrumbs for me, such as Air Command Staff College. People write these papers for their course, PME course. Well, this young woman wrote this and left enough breadcrumbs for me. So if you think no one's reading your papers, I am, right? So I know who to call, and I start, making phone calls and emails and basically stalking this team until they answer their email and phones. I actually had someone basically walk into the building and find one of the lead scientists because I knew they had the cornerstone to my argument. And I said, I need you to document everything we just talked about. And I took this document, I took it to the Secretary of Acquisitions, Undersecretary of Acquisitions, Dr. Roper. And I just kind of slid that across the table, and he was super supportive, super shocked, just as much as I was shocked. But I wanted to play by the rules, and I wanted to do what was best for, our Air Force. I wanted to do what was best for our country, but I also wanted to fix this problem. But he decided to publish it in a memo, and I was full for it. They're not going to let Lieutenant Colonel Ruttenber publish this on the Pentagon just because she excavated the data, right? But he got permission from the Secretary of the Air Force to publish it, and he put it out as a memo with the solution that we proposed to him 2 weeks later.
Okay. And then what happened from that point?
Well, this is a very hybrid, this. We're shorting a very long story of the process of us going around. There was a lot of people that did this with me. It's not just me. There's a lot of amazing individuals that jumped on the train with me. Andrea Harrington, Chris Dawson. There's just so many. Sparkles, she was an A-10 pilot. There were so many parts of this. It's not just the 74% Black women. There's so many other parts that there's not even a waiver for enlisted. It's only for officers. Even in 2020, it was so many parts that needed to be fixed. Like I said, there's so many compartmentalized things that people can't really see the big picture. So I put all the data on a PowerPoint, because that's what we do in the Air Force, PowerPoint presentation. I did a roadshow, and I talked to General Levitt. She was an ATC. That's the first female fighter pilot in the Air Force. And I explained to her why the waiver process doesn't fix it. It's a temporary solution that was a good fix 20-something years ago when we discovered this, or finally decided to try to do something about it.
Right.
And but it ended up being the long-term solution and never resolved the issue. So here I am. I do this roadshow, and I take it to Dr. Roper because I know he has the authority, and I have to get too many people on this boat that I'm just a lieutenant colonel. I'm barely enough ranked to get coffee for some people in the Pentagon, if you've ever been there. So all these people, I have to get them on board, and I can't, but he can because he has the authority. So I need to get to him. And he was amazing. Like, I had never seen anything like that. I walked into his office and I had a meeting with him. He was the final guy I had to brief. I pre-briefed everybody so there wouldn't be any questions. And I got 15 minutes or 10 minutes, and I was scheduled for an hour. And I walk into his office and I'm like, how am I going to get through all this data with him? And I just look at him and I was like, I need $4 million and you just sign this policy today. Like, I'm just going to cut to the chase. And he laughed so hard. He's like, I cannot wait to hear what you're going to tell me next, because I've never seen anybody come straight out and just tell me what they needed like that. And he canceled his meetings for the next 2-3 hours. As I was like, yeah, let me go through this slide for you, and this slide for you, and this slide for you. And I was like, the engineering charts, and going, and this is how we fix it. And this is the regulation that I would fix it. And he was all in, and he gave us the money.
I mean, what happened?
So we slowly fixed it in pieces. The first thing I like to mention before I even got there was everyone thinks there's a waiver. So we fixed it, but a waiver masks a bigger problem. Sure. The bigger problem is that we're not designing aircraft to the
absolutely
recruiting population.
It's an engineering issue.
Right. It's an engineering issue. So when we do masks and we don't fix the underlying issue, we're going to continually make the same problem over and over again. And this is what I see from what I have observed, just Ruttenber, when there is DE&I issues, that sometimes we react instead of respond.
Right.
And we throw money at stuff, and we don't really do the long-term work and the long-term policy change that we need to really fix things. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes sense in so many areas. And that's why people get irritated at some of the DEI lip service or the initiatives that are more about PR.
Totally right. I understand. I feel, if you're listening to this going, blah, 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 I feel the frustration, right? I seen it when we were reacting to Black Lives Matter. They put a task force together. And of course, I volunteered for that because I wanted in, because I knew money was coming with that. And I needed more money for my initiatives that I was trying to get. And I watched them just start hey, we're just going to give, 100 full ride scholarship to historically Black colleges, right? But the problem was they were just reacting. And then when they gave these scholarships out, more than half of them weren't even medically qualified. So the money just went back to the Air Force. We didn't really fix a lot. I know there was some good done, right? But we could have done so much more if we would slow down and really listen to the people in the field to actually see what's going on. And the waiver was one of them. And I was in General Goldfein's conference room. That's the chief of staff of the Air Force at the time, who was trying to figure out why we had such low numbers when it came to minorities and women in the aviation career fields compared to the other parts of the service. And I was there for a different reason. That was the whole pregnancy and flying and maternity flight suits. I had an agenda there. I was trying to explain that we could talk about later. I flew with all 3 of my children in 2 different aircraft in 3 different commands, and continue to get the mission done all the way up until birth. And I'm blessed that I had a really good pregnancy and was healthy enough to do that. But I was there for that. And then I hear them go to the next subject about height waivers. And I hear, and I'm not going to call names because we should go after ideas and not individuals. Not to say you shouldn't recruit someone who does something illegal, but this 3 I just want to caveat that there's difference. This 3-star general briefs General Goldfein that there is no problem with the waivers, that they are 100% approved, every single one that goes across his desk. So that 44% you're hearing, that's not a thing. We have a waiver that's been fixed. And I was like, huh. And it bugged me and it bugged me and it bugged me until I was like, all right, I'm going to dig a little deeper. And I did. And I found out that 44% of the waivers that get across your desk, yes, but how many were not applied for? Because women were self-eliminating when they were told they were not medically cleared to fly because of their height. Now, this does affect some men, but compared to women, it's a much larger portion. Men, it actually is 3.7%. I just want to make sure I had that right, compared to the 44% of women. So
Can I talk to you for 1 second about the waiver? If it's an engineering problem that you can't hit the controls, does the waiver solve the underlying issue of safety?
No, and that was the biggest thing. We all agree that you have to be safe enough to fly. If I could not reach the rudder pedals in the KC-135 and the T handles to the fire switch, I would not be flying today. Hands down, safety first. Now, this is the problem with the waiver, is we are giving people waivers, but then saying you can only fly the KC-135. So are we really fixing the problem? Or are we just, because that implies that they could fly any aircraft. We're not giving that information to the chief of staff of the Air Force that, yes, I have a waiver that impacts 44% of women, but don't worry, we got 100% of them approved. Everything is good to go. But what we're not saying is our websites and our own medical teams don't know there's a waiver, don't mention there's a waiver. So the people who do the waivers don't know to say, hey, hold up, you are qualified, just need to go do some extra measurements to make sure you're safe. And they're just out. So how do you measure that? Is it really 100% when we know that a lot of people will be like, hey, you have to be over, under 200 pounds and you weigh 230. Well, you might be able to lose some weight for an ejection seat, but you can't make yourself taller. You can't make yourself shorter.
It just begs the question of why aren't our aircraft, especially the ones that are being built now, why aren't they being built in a way that would accommodate more heights?
Right. That's the crux of the whole thing. So again, the 1960s anthropometric survey, this is where they designed the human system integration into the aircraft. Whether we're going to talk about helmets, G-suits, ejection seats, the actual interaction of the human to the aircraft. And they didn't update this database until 2012, when they realized they had hardly any minorities and 0 women in it. And they tried to fix it, but like everything happens with bureaucracy, or the next administration comes. They ran out of money and time, and they did the best they could. So they augmented the survey with an Army survey to get more minorities in, but we fell short of women again. So we don't actually know. So they did all these quick fixes, and the quick fixes is like the F-15 only accommodates 8.9% of women. So yes, if you get a waiver, you only have an 8.9% chance of flying that aircraft. The C-130, the C-17, which, by the way, we're going to be flying out until 2050, especially with the C-17. It eliminates 1 out of 3 women for their sitting height because they have to see above and the HUD. I can go on and on again. So we're basically saying you can fly like 1 or 2 aircraft.
And this probably just doesn't affect just the Air Force. This obviously impacts the Navy.
Right. They have their own standards.
Yeah. I mean, this is, I don't know.
Why not build in the beginning of this process in acquisitions when we're coming up with the joint requirements of what is required? So if I could have my one wish, it would be go to the joint chairman and say, I want you to put this in your acquisitions process for redesign the requirements that it has to be inclusive of 95% of the population in which we recruit from. Notice I didn't say minorities. Notice I didn't say women. I want the largest population I can get to have the most qualified candidates.
Absolutely,
that is the solution.
Jessica.
And it wasn't until the F-35 that came around that we actually got it right. So let's say maybe you made it through the process, you've got a waiver. Well, The F-35 is inclusive to 97.5% of women, but it didn't start off that way. And even if you got a waiver, if you have to fly the pre-aircraft to the T-38, which is the F-35, which is the T-38, which eliminates you getting access to the 135. So when you brief Congress, hey, it's fixed, it's 97.5%, but we fail to mention the T-38 is the trainer to, the F-35. We're getting there. We're getting there slowly. It's not all doom and gloom. But the problem with the F-35, and this was like the thing that really opened my eyes to figure out how to fix this, was a paper written by Dr. Hudson. And in it, he writes that when they came up with the requirements for the F-35, that it only had 55% of women qualified based on their height and sitting height. And they're like, kind of bad looking. So the Department of Defense Undersecretary of Acquisition, I forgot his name at the time, said let's make it a little higher to 80%, but only because he said so. It was not part of the requirement to do that, and it wasn't. So we're still okay with it eliminating 1 out of 5 women today. Like the F-35 is our Joint Strike Fighter. It's not like an older like an F-15 or an F-16. Sorry guys if you're listening. And it wasn't until Congress intervened that it is what it is today. So what do we have in our own process as a forcing mechanism to make sure that we are building aircraft to the human, not the human to the aircraft, right? And that's how we solve this problem. And if we can't solve it with the big ticket items, with $100 million aircraft, how do we have a chance when it comes to smaller things like G-suits and helmets, when we don't have Congress looking at them so closely because the dollar amount is so much smaller? And we can talk about that a little bit later. So that was my proposal to Dr. Roper. Make it a requirement for the United States Air Force for anything in their acquisition process that has to do with air crew or development of aircraft to be inclusive of 95% of the recruiting population without a special waiver from the Secretary of the Air Force, like at that level, right? And that's what he signed.
Wow. That's incredible, Jessica. What made you this kind of person who didn't just work her job, raise her family, but instead you're going to start tackling these systemic issues that are occurring across not only the Air Force, but I would argue DoD in general?
I didn't start off this way as like, I just wanted to do my job. And I didn't think I was too short because I was a woman. I just thought I was short. I didn't know the average height of a woman was my height. And I just wanted to do my job. And then I noticed these things going along in my career, but I was very patriotic. I loved flying. I loved deploying.
Sure.
I loved getting the mission done. And then I decided to have children. And then things started becoming difficult for me because I decided to have children. Even though I was flying, people were counting me out. And I was really, really mad because I was like,
so
what are you talking?
5 months pregnant and still flying.
I'm 5 months pregnant and I'm flying this plane. And I'm like, but I'm lady bossing it as instructor pilot. I've met all the things. I've got my degrees. I've checked all the boxes. I'm like, why are you asking me to take a knee or taking away those job opportunities for me or taking away my strat? And at first I had a little bit of imposter syndrome. I'm like, well, maybe I've slowed down. I'm like, no, I didn't, because fast forward 3 children later, I'm at Altus Air Force Base, Oklahoma. And at this point, I'm like, not apologize. I'm even like, sorry, I'm just going to say it. I'm pumping in the plane while I'm flying, and I'm like flying with, hold on, putting on, like, there is no apologies, right? I'm getting the mission done. I'm taking care of what my family needs. And, but then I start leading women and I notice what's happening to them. And I was like, we're just trying to get our job done. Why are you making it so hard? So for me, it wasn't a female issue. It was just like, why are you making it so hard for me to do my job? And at this particular base, the lead doctor didn't want women to fly pregnant because of his personal beliefs, even though they're allowed to fly their second trimester if they have a healthy pregnancy. We can go into details about that. I can tell you the science behind that. And he was rejecting them and just was not having it, and filed a complaint against him and took all these women. And I'm like, if you want to fly, fly. If you don't want to fly, that's fine too. You can still contribute to the mission by being an instructor pilot and teaching, and that frees up somebody that has to be in the classroom to go fly. So you're not slowing down the mission at all. And I just started getting really angry that you were impacting my airman's career. It's one thing when you mess with mine. And when I say you, I mean, most people were supportive, but there's a few individuals that had enough power or influence to make decisions of my assignments and my stratifications on my performance reports. They made it very difficult for me. And it really came down to one woman. Her name was Melissa, and she wanted to go to squadron officer school while she was pregnant, and she was a pilot. And in the first trimester, you can't fly. You can now. We changed that. That's why I was in Goldfein's office. And and we're like, hey, this is the perfect time to send her to professional military education, which is primarily classroom stuff, although they do have some obstacle course stuff. But that stuff is not a big deal. People get wavered all the time if they break an arm. We're like, well, guess what? Our commander would not let her go. Because, again, when I'm briefing at the Pentagon, fast forward 5 years later, they're saying, oh, we approve 95% of these waivers at S.O.S., but what doesn't get to S.O.S? This commander said no, and it never left the wing. So how is higher headquarters supposed to measure what didn't get applied for?
Right.
So if you're listening to this,
they're getting stopped at the door. They're getting stopped even before they go in the door.
Yeah, if you're a partner or a wife or a male or husband of a birthing parent that's active duty, and you want your leave that you're entitled to as a caregiver, do not take a verbal no. Make them go in the system when you say I'm submitting it and reject it. One, I promise you they're probably going to turn around and approve it because now it's on record. Yeah. And two, now the Air Force can measure it if they do decline it, and we can see an accurate representation. Was this person so mission critical we couldn't give them a couple weeks here and then break it up and later? I would say most of the time we can. There will be exceptions when we do have to, disapprove. But you can also do that for a woman, right? After the convalescent period, you could also, the birthing parent, you could absolutely say, no, you're mission critical, you're coming back after you're medically cleared. And but we don't do that because it's taboo. But it's okay for usually the male counterpart. It's not as accepted. So that's where I was there with that. And that's where I started going. So Melissa got disapproved for S.O.S. Her waiver was getting held up by that medical doctor. I was like, she is not going to make it. She's like, no wonder why women are getting out. They're not letting her fly. They're not letting her go to PME, which she needs for promotion. And now they want to send her after the baby is born when she can fly, which makes no sense because now, anyway.
Sure.
I said, hey, we could file a complaint against this guy, but you're coming up for your majors board. Keep your head down because I know how this is going to go. You're going to lose your certifications because we can't prove it, but it's going to be, what do you call it? Reprisal for trying to, right? I said, but I promise you I'll find a way to fix this. And I started writing papers about why it enhances the aircrew and, the Air Force's readiness numbers by allowing women to go to S.O.S. pregnant when they're already down in most cases, so that they can hit the ground running when they come back. And
I would advantage of the timing. I mean, why not go and get an education while you're
there? Were so many, and this is the game changer: social media. So I find a lot more Melissas and take all that stack, right? It's not just that one off. Before, I think we were kind of siloed. So it was hard to find one another. So I write these papers and I shotgun them to everybody in the universe. I go on these Facebook rants. I don't know what I'm doing. And then finally somebody finds me because they actually read something I wrote and it was like, hey, you should probably join this team. And I call into the Women's Initiative team. And I don't really go too far with it because I'm physically not there. I just had my third baby. I'm still flying, but I know of them. So eventually I get to the Pentagon in the most obscure kind of way. and I have all this knowledge, and I find that these are the people that can actually do something about it. And I was like, well, I might as well start walking around like Dora the Explorer with her little backpack of kids. And I wrote a paper like on all these issues and any general. If you've ever been to the Pentagon, like you can't swing a dead cat without hitting a general. Like they're everywhere. So I'm just like talking them up, down the hall. Here's a paper. Can I get on your schedule just for 5 minutes? I'm like bringing coffee.
You're basically being a lobbyist.
Trying to get on the schedule. I'm doing whatever it takes.
Yeah, you're a lobbyist.
Once you start digging, you're like, I literally just went there and I said, hey, I would like to fly pregnant using real data from real medical journals and not your benevolent sexism with 8 studies written by 2 different people from the 1960s and find the actual hazards, right, that have to do with flying an aircraft, like noise, vibration, acceleration. Let's measure this and see if it's present. And I found that in most cases, it's perfectly fine to fly pregnant in most of our aircraft, not all of it, but most of our aircraft. You drive a car, it's actually much more riskier than flying pregnant. Yet we say, oh, you're pregnant, you can't.
Which really impacts people who have to keep up their flight hours when they're not on deployment. And they need that opportunity to be able to fly and do their job and stay competitive with their peers. So it's a no-brainer.
I think it's interesting when we think of women, we think, I've heard the argument that we're a drain on the resources because we're non-deployable when we get pregnant. And that makes a lot of assumptions. And it's really funny that we focus on pregnancy as, oh, you can't deploy because you're pregnant. Like every woman is having 5 babies and in the service, right? When we know the average female pilot doesn't have her first child until the age of 29 because she has to go through so much training. Not to say that someone that's 23 hasn't, but the starting age is 29. And you take that, and if you really, really look at the data and you're like, hey, did you know you can't deploy because of administrative discipline? There's a DAV code for that, meaning you got Article 15 or you're waiting for initial punishment. Most of those are men. And if you tally that percentage compared to the women that are pregnant, it's men are actually worse when it comes to deployment.
Are draining the system more because of disciplinary issues.
Females are draining our readiness. But really, we all have things.
Exactly.
Right?
I mean, it's a fact of life. If you want a mission-ready, a combat-ready force, you must include women. I 100% believe that.
And we have,
you're going to have to accommodate the pregnancy issue.
You can easily rebucket people, right? Like, Jess, you're pregnant now. 6 months from now, we'll just swap. We can plan for these things.
Right. And that's why I've said this, and I'll say it again, even though I am supporting Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense, I would love to see him go deeper into some of his views regarding women in combat, because I still don't believe they're fully clarified, because I do believe that women do play a role in combat arms positions. I know there's challenges in terms of gear and in terms of let's say cohesiveness in some people's opinions. But I believe that those are all challenges that if somebody meets the standards for that occupation, realistic standards that need to be met for that job, not some physical requirement that we know only men can pass. No, something that no shit you need to have for that job. Okay, well then if a woman meets that, then she ought to be given that same opportunity and that same path to 4-star. I feel very passionate about this.
I do too. And I think the U.S. population doesn't really understand the military, since so few of us serve now. And we have a lot of misconceptions of what combat looks like. And I think this face of war is changing. And, we're no longer in a war with terrorism as much as we are with, near peers like, China, that has 15 times the STEM graduates and 4 times, the GDP and all this kind of stuff, right? They have more money, they're smarter, and they have, more people, and they're outpacing us. So why wouldn't we want access to the entire recruiting population? Why would we eliminate?
No brainer.
Right. We want the most qualified person flying the most advanced aircraft to be, in the most lethal military in the world. And like I said, when I started, I didn't start making this a women's issue. I wanted to do my job, and I would never ask for a waiver for somebody that was not safe to fly. Because in the end, we all want the same thing. We want to have the best Air Force. And I believe that is having with women.
Yeah. I had a really great discussion on my feed the other day about affirmative action. And I've always felt that it was this unfair advantage. And I had somebody explain it to me of no, it is initiatives that get people in the door that wouldn't know about the opportunity otherwise. And if I thought about it like that, I can get on board. Like if you're going to need to go to historically Black colleges to recruit, or if you're going to need to go to a women in STEM conference to pull in more military women who wouldn't necessarily know about the military unless you were there recruiting. Well, then I have to think that's a good thing, because as we've seen in Ukraine, for an example, some of their best drone operators are women. And I believe that if you don't include them in your war, then you are not going to be as lethal, hands down.
Yeah, absolutely. And the nonprofit I started, Level Up Aviation, we do two things. We help underserved communities, but we do it in two ways, because I don't think it should be based on gender or race. It's really economic disadvantage. So we give scholarships to people to who they need them. But we do outreach to the communities, especially with the younger folks, because we want to get that, that population of like 10 to 14 years old to start getting that interest. We don't want to wait until college. It's been too late if we're trying to recruit them. So we do outreach. We're not going to give them, a $20,000 scholarship, but we are going to spend a little money to go out there and take some people that look like them out there, so that they realize, hey, this is an opportunity for me, because historically people in that background don't look like me. So I might not connect those two opportunities because I've never seen it before.
Absolutely. It's kind of like, this is a smaller example, but when I decided to become a podcaster and I wanted to see who the top podcasters were, I saw people like Rogan or Jordan Peterson or now Sean Ryan. But then I didn't really see somebody who I could relate to as some of the top female podcasters. And so I thought, wow, that's really unfortunate that there isn't somebody out there that's doing these kinds of shows that I think are a little bit more edgy and question things and are willing to have the hard conversations. And I thought, why haven't I seen that? And so I think that it's really incumbent upon us to create the things that we want to see, especially as we age.
Yes.
We're supposed to be creating those paths for the people that come after us, so that they can see.
Like we have to leave something behind for them, and that's how we, remain relevant, or give purpose or pay back something that was given to us when we were younger.
Absolutely. And we have some people joining us, and I'm sorry I haven't gotten to the comments, but John Cordell, he was when we were talking about the 95% of people that should have that opportunity, he said DoD has requirements for accommodating 5 to 95% for male and female, my understanding. So
yes, they do, because Dr. Roper signed that memo, and then the memo expired a year later. I remember, because we want it in the regulation, because that would make it very difficult, but regulations could take 2-3 years to change. So I said, if you signed, these are your options, sir. If you sign this, you only need a legal review and the Secretary of the Air Force to say yes. But the problem with this option is it's going to have to be done every year. So yeah. Dr. Roper signed it the first year. It is starting to expire. It didn't make it into the regulation. The second year, I'm literally at my retirement ceremony on the phone before going on stage, talking to the executive to get the next person, because Dr. Roper just left and there is a transition person in there, and I'm talking them through the thing to get it re-signed. So I get it re-signed on the day of my retirement for another year. Then I win an award for women in government, for championing a campaign. I get to meet the Secretary of the Air Force again, but as a civilian. So when I go in there, I take the opportunity to start pitching him that this should be in a regulation. And it's been in a memo, and it's going to die with this memo. And there was many people that help that happen. I just want to make that clear. And that, sir, is why it's in the regulation.
Love it. Love it. And then Amber, she came on here too, and she made another comment and just said, we have some really great perspective here to see how impactful you've been on your airmen and continue to be for future airmen coming next, as we just said. And Tab is Tab Bartley. She also has a podcast called the Oaths You Took podcast, and it's she features Marines, and she's just saying, now you are that. I'm talking about how we create the change we want to see, and you've done just that. And now I'm curious, though. I have to ask this: why did you retire? Was it for family, or are you okay sharing that?
I was coming up on 21 years, and honestly, I would have kept on serving. Joint spouse is very difficult.
Yep.
Still serving. We're now at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery. We have had some difficult times getting stationed together, and things have changed significantly since then. But he was not allowed to take any leave during the birth of our children, even though I was the one deploying, like right out after having a baby, a few months. We didn't have what we had today. And he was the staffer, and he was the school guy, and he was raising our children. But they still didn't want him to have, maternity leave, or parental leave, or caregiver leave. We had to fight that. And I got tired at 21 years. And I got to be honest, to go at this level for 3 years that I did in the Pentagon, I saw it as a window of opportunity, that an obligation that I shouldn't have been there, because I kept getting not passed over, because I was still promotion eligible. I was always the third draft round pick. And somehow I'd get to the first round because the first guy and the second guy, got hurt. And it just kept going, right? Because I had a good work ethic. And even though my strats were going down when I had children, I ended up getting in this Pentagon job. And I was like the unlikeliest person to be there, because all these people were like number one and strats and everything.
Sure.
And I absolutely deserved to be there. And I did a really great job. But in my mind, it was like all the school graduates, all the stuff, people that go there. And I said, there's a reason I'm here. And it's because there's just no one else that looks like me in these jobs, except for like 5 women that I found. I was like collecting us all. Like, hey, you have to come here, let me talk to you.
Right.
I was like, we should say something. Like, let's make a band. Let's get some t-shirts. And I joined the Women's Initiative team. And that's why I did that. But I got really tired. And I burned out a little bit. And
I was gonna say, advocacy is exhausting. You have a wonderful sense of humor, and I'm wondering if that helped you, because
this wasn't my job. I would stay up after the kids went to bed, after I did my day job, and I would stay up until 12 o'clock, 1 a.m. writing these things, because no one's writing it, because it's no one's job. It's a side hustle. And when you have an opportunity to get draft language into the National Defense Authorization Act to prevent pregnancy discrimination, you drop what you're doing. And sometimes I wouldn't sleep at all. And so once I got pregnancy discrimination through with Representative Holland's office, like with amazing women like Abby Curtis, who was her military liaison, I felt like I'd done enough. And I said, okay, it's not about pregnancy and flying. It's about women want to have children and not be penalized. And I know there's the stereotype of this one person in their office that uses it to get out of their deployment, but I don't think that's the case. And I don't think the data proves that either. And that so many women, it was like whack-a-mole. Once I get this one woman, her waiver to fly, this one couldn't go to S.O.S. Oh, this one lost their intel assignment because they need their polygraph, but there's no waiver for a polygraph when you're pregnant. So we'll just have to wait till next year. So that assignment that you needed for your timing is gone. Like, it was everywhere. And eventually I pulled back. I said, big picture, I love flying. I want to help the women flying. We really need to solve this at a DoD level. And I started writing papers and putting myself out there. I started testifying on the DACWITS, the Defense Advisory Women on Service, in the service, on record. And I didn't just complain about it. I pulled the data. I said, this is how many people it impacts. This is what happens to readiness when we don't support women. And this is how much it cost us. And this is the language I would change to fix it. And I eventually got with Representative Holland's office, because I wrote the stuff on paper, and it wasn't just a briefing I had in the Pentagon that goes away once the meeting's over. And I left that breadcrumb trail for people to find me. And that's how we got it passed. And once that got passed, well, first it was in the draft NDAA. Then Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, sees the writing on the wall. You can see the draft, right? It passed the House, it passed the Senate. It's staying. It's just sitting on the president's desk waiting for like 1,000 other reasons that has nothing to do with that. So he went ahead and made a memo saying, we're going to do this. We're going to add this to equal opportunity policy, because what I didn't know was when I wanted to file a lawsuit against, the Secretary of the Air Force for not letting us fly pregnant because you didn't have fact-based data. Someone had mentioned it, and I was like, yeah, why aren't we doing this? It was because he hadn't broken any rules, because we didn't recognize pregnancy discrimination. We recognized gender, race, religion, all these things.
It wasn't a protected class.
Policy, but we omitted pregnancy discrimination. And no one kind of noticed that. I think most people don't notice that. So when you don't get that job because you're pregnant and you want to do a complaint against the commander for not hiring you because you might take maternity leave, they didn't break any rules because pregnancy discrimination was technically allowed. So that's what we did. We put it into the equal opportunity policy. So you really have to justify it with factual data and how it impacts the mission, and not because you're like, oh, well, she's probably going to get out anyway.
Wow. Geez, Jessica. I mean, it's just amazing listening to your story and the amount of initiatives and things that a person can do by building a coalition. And it just makes me wonder, like, what is it about certain people who do this, and then other people who just think it's too hard, I can't do it, I can't be the one that pushes this change?
I think you have to be passionate about it. A lot of times it impacts you personally or impacts someone that you love. Mm-hmm. I found that some of their greatest advocates were men, and especially men who had daughters that were coming of age. And they moved mountains to get me into the next door, to the next conversation, because they probably went to school with this guy that, General Crum was one of those amazing advocates that said, hey, anybody you need to talk to, tell me what to do. And I was like, A, B, and C. And he did exactly what he said he was going to do. And he's a very busy man. So I really appreciate that. So
how did you battle the pushback that you would get? I mean, I'm sure that you probably, you're such a charming person and you're funny. So you definitely, hopefully didn't ruffle too many feathers, but how did you get it so that you didn't piss people off?
I did piss people off, but I did it in a way. I like the Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote about, I'm going to butcher this, but, do it in a way that others will follow you. And I did it. Like, I'm very excited talking to you, but when I'm in a room with a bunch of people, I don't use my hands. I don't raise my voice. I don't get emotional. I talk about the readiness numbers and how this impacts and how we're going to lose to China if we don't get access to that full recruiting population. And if anybody in this room, starts pushing back, I like to play mind tricks and go, well, you're acting very emotional right now. Let's look at the data, So even though I'm angry and emotional, I learned this from other women that I thought were sexist, but they weren't. They were holding their cards. And I might not say their name because I don't want them to get in trouble, but I was like, oh, you only get so many of these cards. So they wait and hold them until it's something very important. And I just decided to go all in. And I think you need women that need to make, and advocates that need to make that 3 and 4 star level, but you also need people at like the ground level that are going to do the work. And it is true that when we have younger folks like Melissa, who couldn't go to S.O.S and was coming up for a promotion board, well, she was going to have reprisal with this guy, most likely. Statistically, she was. So she's probably not going to want to, rattle too many cages, although I'm sure she would have if, we really got her worked up, because she's an amazing leader. But I made it to 20, where I was about to make it to 20. And I decided I loved Afghanistan. I loved Iraq. I loved flying all those missions, but this was the last mission I wanted to fly.
I love it. I can relate to so much of what you're saying. I mean, this podcast was my last mission in a way, even though it's an off-duty endeavor. It's taking the years and years that I've learned to communicate for the Navy, the experiences I've had in all these different Navy fields, and using that to impact change through the career that I've kept doing over and over and over again, and finding ways to do it in a way and advocate in a way, like you said, that is not going to feed into the stereotype that people have about women, which is that, we're just overly emotional. We don't look at the data. We don't make logical decisions. And so it's just such a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, I appreciate it. And I've been following you. And I remember the first time I decided to go on record and write my own article, how terrified I was, because I think you're conditioned when you're younger. And before this generation of new leaders that are coming in, we didn't have the interwebs. We didn't have cell phones.
No.
So we didn't have all these things. So the chain of command was very important, and it still is very important. But I'm able to get that information on the internet so fast, finding so many women around the world to gather data to give informally to the Pentagon to say, your data is wrong, and I can show you based on these surveys. And that was amazing. And then I started to say it, and I didn't want to get anybody in trouble, so I used my story. This happened to me. And I wasn't making it about me. I was saying, this happened to me. This is the regulations, and this is the impact of readiness. And that way people would listen instead of using somebody else's story. And I was really worried I was going to get in a lot of trouble. And I do think that if I was younger, you can get labeled. Like, look at the environment right now. They're saying stuff like, if you're a DEI, we're going to go in there and we're going to find you. And there's threats and there's misconceptions, and people are afraid.
People don't understand what DEI is. I
want the most lethal Air Force, and I'd like to end it with a story, if it's okay, of why this is important. So I'm going through this waiver process, and I find out there's no waivers for enlisted. And we have a lot of enlisted flyers. There are boom operators, refuelers, there are load masters on C-17s, C-130s, they're flying linguists, they're flight attendants. Like, we have all these career fields, the enlisted fly. Zero waiver. They can't get even, so there's not even a chance. And there's a man named Chris Dawson who someone mentions it to him, just like things are mentioned to me. Maybe I didn't come up with the original idea, but I ran with the ball. And he finds out there's no waiver for women, and he starts his own team, but he's so early in the process that I started dialing in, and I'm listening because I don't have the bandwidth to fight for the enlisted and the officers, but I'm keeping abreast of what he's doing. When he finally comes up with a solution and has enough data, I call him up and I'm just like, hey, welcome to the Women's Initiative team. You're now part of this brief. And that was the $4 million I asked for Dr. Roper to get the study to actually measure the crew positions in the back of the plane, because we didn't have any measurements of the crew positions in the back of the plane. We just used the same standards. We had some, but not the ones to measure height. We just said, if you're in the back of the plane, you need to be as tall as the pilots in the front of the plane. Well, if you're a flying linguist, right, and they call it, I can't even say it, so I had to write it down, the airborne cryptological analysis, so basically you're a flying linguist, right?
Mm-hmm.
All you have to do is sit on the back of the plane, like any passenger would, to intercept real-time messages from adversaries and countries of our that we consider near peers, like Chinese Mandarin language, and bring that back into the United States, so real-time intel that they can make decisions to the decision make information to the decision maker. But we're eliminating all these individuals because they're not tall enough to sit in the back seat. And the problem with that is you have to be very intelligent to learn to speak multiple languages. If you weren't born with multiple languages, to learn a new language is very difficult. And because they eliminated so many women from the enlisted crew positions, they didn't have enough individuals that were qualified to be flying linguists. So what they ended up doing was lowering the DLA, the Defense Language Aptitude Test, to get more candidates in, men, and they end up washing out at a really high rate at $125,000 a pop. At the same time, if they would have just taken an hour with those, scientists that are at Right Pat and measure those seats, they would have realized that you could have been 5 foot instead of 5'4". And guess who tends to be short? Asian women who probably already have an aptitude for that language and that skill. So really, you're shooting yourself in the foot. And that's where I say you are not making us lethal. You're making us less lethal in many examples, and it's costing us money. And we're actually lowering standards because we don't have enough qualified candidates.
This is the conversation that needs to be happening when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And the whole DEI thing. I think that there is a school of thought that DEI, and I've heard it. My friend Chase was just on my podcast, and he talked about how it's born out of this idea of oppress and oppressors and trying to find ways to divide us. And I can see that line of thinking. I can see where people feel that they're not part of these discussions, or they're not in class, these groups, then they don't feel like they're included, and they feel like it's dividing us. But we have to have these conversations because we're going to eliminate people that could potentially join our fight.
So, yeah, absolutely. And the Department of Defense released in 2018 that 71% of America's youth isn't eligible to serve for many reasons: criminal records, medical, yada, yada. And I know that they came up with a new release, but it's even worse than 71%, but I don't know that number, so I won't say it. So again, China, more money, more people, smarter people, and Americans getting heavier and getting less qualified. And like, what are we doing here, folks? You know, I'm sure you can find that one job that we can make an exception and put that on the CNN. But we're talking about the larger military and our
picture. So, well, Jessica, I appreciate this so much. Is there anything that you wish to add that we didn't cover during the show?
No, I just really want to talk about this anthropometrics to make sure that it's on record. To leave enough trail for people so that, you know, if for some reason this is challenged, I would definitely, if I were to solve this long term and just went to the military, you know, stayed in and got to joint staff, I would take that 95 percentile and I would make it an acquisitions regulation at the joint level and not just the Air Force level.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I'm going to meet you backstage. I'm going to go full screen real fast and just say goodbye to everyone. But thank you so much for coming on the Stories of Service podcast, Jessica.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, guys. Thanks so much. I'm here in my empty room. We moved into our house today. Household Goods just left a few hours ago. So I will be coming at you next week. I think I'm going to be taking off a week over Christmas break. But as I always say to close these podcasts, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please take care of yourself. Take care of each other and have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye now.